The sun is barely up, and the dust already tastes like chalk on your tongue. You stand in a line so tight your shoulder brushes the man beside you. Bronze flashing cold blue before it warms. The ground trembles under a synchronized first step. Shields rising like a single wall. Somewhere ahead, another wall is coming toward you. If you were dropped into this moment, you probably wouldn't survive, not because you're weak, but because everything here depends on habits you don't have. Keeping pace, keeping nerve, keeping your place when your lungs beg to bolt. This is the world that produced the Greek hoplite, a citizen soldier born not in barracks, but in the polis. In the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, as city-states hardened their identities, wealth spread enough that middling landowners could buy armor, and warfare shifted from aristocratic skirmishes to massed battle. The Lelantine War between Chalcis and Eretria is often cited as an early proving ground for this new style, to communities fielding ranks of similarly equipped men, deciding disputes in a single, terrifying collision. Hoplites functioned as heavy infantry whose power came less from individual heroics than from collective geometry. Each man's aspis shield covered his left side and the right side of his neighbor, knitting the line into a moving fort. Spears angled forward, rear ranks pressing the front onward, and victory usually meant making the other formation crack. First, the strengths were obvious: cohesion, shock, and a moral economy where you fought for your farm, your laws, your relatives watching from the hills. Yet the weaknesses sat right inside the same logic: rigidity, dependence on flat ground, and a system that punished panic more than it rewarded brilliance. The skills demanded were social as much as physical: trust, rhythmic marching, and the ability to absorb fear without breaking alignment. A strange side fact from later writers is that Spartans piped simple flute tunes as they advanced, not for drama, but to keep step, a kind of ancient metronome. There's academic debate over whether the hoplite revolution was a sudden break or a long, uneven evolution, but either way, compared to the chariot elites of the Near East or the missile-heavy raiders of earlier Greece, this was a blunt new answer: citizens in bronze, marching in near-perfect formation, turning war into a communal act. That communal act had a price tag you could measure in bronze and ox hides. The hoplite panoply wasn't a uniform issued by the state. It was a personal investment, often the most expensive thing a household owned. Start with the aspis, the great round shield about a meter wide, wood faced with bronze and gripped by a central porpax and hand strap. It weighed enough that your left arm would ache for days after a march, yet its design forced you to stay locked to the man on your right. Then the dory spear, usually 2 to 3 meters, leaf-shaped iron head up front and a bronze butt spike sword, lizard killer, behind. So if the tip snapped, you could reverse it and keep fighting. On your head a Corinthian or Chalcidian helmet narrowed vision to a slit, turning the world into tunnel and clang. A bell cuirass or laminated linothorax guarded the torso, and greaves clamped your shins like rigid sandals. One officially recognized turning point for this kit is the mid-7th century BCE, when archaeological finds and vase paintings show the full set becoming standard. The famous Shigi vase practically reads like a diagram of hoplite equipment and formation. Functionally, all of it served the phalanx's battlefield job: endure the initial spear exchange, keep pushing, keep the shield wall intact. The strength was durability and mutual protection. The weakness was fatigue, heat, and cost. Heavier bronze meant better survival odds in a shove match, but poorer speed on rough ground. And not every city's farmers could afford it. That economic filter is why hoplites were citizens in a very specific sense: property owning. Men with enough stake in the polis to buy their own safety. Skill-wise, you needed more than muscles. The aspis required instinctive micro-adjustment: stilt, overlap, recover without opening gaps. The dory demanded precise thrusting in tight quarters, not wild swings. You trained your body to tolerate cramped air and your mind to fight half-blind under a helmet, while listening for shouted commands. A lesser-known quirk: some shields carried personal emblems not just for pride, but for identification in the press, a crude friend or foe system. There's academic debate about how much of the panoply was truly standard versus locally improvised. Yet compared to lighter skirmishers like early Peltas or the bow-using Assyrians, Hoplite gear bet everything on close, disciplined collision, and it paid off as long as the ground and the nerves held. If the armor was personal, the discipline was public. Most hoplites were not professionals. They were men who spent most of the year pruning vines, firing pottery, or arguing in assembly, then stepped into ranks when the city called. Athens' reforms under Solon in the early 6th century BCE are an officially recognized example of how the civic-military link tightened. Political rights were tied to property classes, and those who could afford hoplite gear gained a louder voice. So the phalanx and the democracy to be grew up together. The army functioned less like a standing force and more like a seasonal, socially enforced machine. Muster days pulled neighbors into the same file they shared at festivals, and that familiarity was a kind of training all by itself. Formal drills varied by polis. Sparta was the outlier, with state-run agage training boys from youth. But even there the end product was the same citizen line. Elsewhere, practice happened in public squares or during gymnastic festivals, and skill built through repetition of a few essentials: marching in time, wheeling left or right without tearing the line, raising shields on a cue, passing commands down ranks where only the front could see. Strengths of this system were moral pressure and intuitive teamwork. If you fled, you didn't just lose a fight, you lost your standing at home. Weaknesses lay in uneven skill and availability. Harvest season could thin the ranks, and long campaigns strained citizen economies more than enemy spears. What soldiers had to master was a blend of athletic and psychological control. You needed stamina for hours of marching underweight, quick reflexes for compressed spear work, and hardest of all, the ability to trust strangers to your left while you exposed your right. Many city-states used songs or call and response, chants to keep cadence and calm breathing. Modern militaries would call it unit cohesion training. But here it was baked into civic life. A strange side fact, in some palaes, older veterans stood in the rear ranks not because they were weakest, but because they were the steadiness reservoir, literally bracing the line when fear rippled forward. There's academic debate about whether hoplite effectiveness came more from drill or from shared social norms. Yet compared to Persia's mix of professionals and levies, or later Roman armies with standardized state equipment, the Greek trick was making part-time citizens fight like a single organism, so long as the organism stayed proud, fed, and close to home. When the armies finally met, everything the city had rehearsed collapsed into a few brutal minutes of order. The phalanx formed in ranks, usually 8 deep in many palaes, sometimes more, each file aligned so shield rims overlapped and spear points projected like a thorn hedge. A herald's final words, a paean rising. Then the advance at a measured walk that might quicken into a jog only in the last stretch. The classic event often used to anchor how this worked is the Battle of Mantinea for 18 BCE, where Thucydides describes lines drifting right as men instinctively tried to shelter behind their neighbor's shield, forcing commanders to plan around that human bias. That tiny angle in march tells you what the formation really was, not a robot wall, but a crowd of nervous bodies trying to stay a wall. In battle function, the first contact was the spear phase. Front ranks thrust overhand or underhand, aiming at faces, throats, and gaps, while second and third ranks jabbed over shoulders. If spears shattered, the line shortened with swords, but the fight wasn't a series of duels. It was a contest of cohesion. Rear ranks pressed forward, and the whole mass tried to drive the other backward. Later writers call this othismos, the push, though there's academic debate over how literal that shove was versus a more fluid pressure anti-h. Rust exchange. Either way, the goal was the same: make the enemy's front lose alignment. Then watch panic widen the rupture. The strengths here were shock and simplicity. A well-kept phalanx could hit like a battering ram, and because every man knew his place, decisions in the chaos were fewer. But the weaknesses were just as structural. The line hated broken ground, hated flanks, hated being forced to stop and restart once gaps opened. The heavy gear that made you safe also made you slow to recover. The skills demanded were micro-level discipline, keeping spear length even, matching stride, hearing commands through helmet ringing, and macro-level courage. the willingness to keep pushing when you could feel the file beside you sagging. A lesser-known detail from some Hoplites is the use of file closers appointed to watch for drifting or hesitation, a human correction system inside the rank. Compared to looser Celtic warbands famed for individual ferocity, or Persian forces relying on archery screens, the phalanx was an argument that geometry beats bravado. As long as the men believe in the geometry, belief in that geometry was tested. In the most famous way on the plain of Marathon, and for 90 BCE the Persians had ships, cavalry, and a reputation for turning battles into aerostorms and flank attacks. The Athenians and Plataeans had a shorter line of heavy citizens, who knew they could not trade missiles all day. So the hoplite function in battle became a calculated sprint. Modern commentary loves to emphasize the run, but the key is why. They crossed the killing ground fast enough to blunt archery, then hit in formation. Miltiades famously widened the Athenian front and thinned the center to match Persian numbers. A tactical gamble that shows the phalanx could be tuned like an instrument. When the lines met, the wings held and wrapped inward, while the weaker center bent without breaking. An early case study in how hoplite strengths shock armor. Cohesion could be paired with admitted weaknesses, a thin center to win anyway. A strange side fact from the sources, the Athenians reportedly left a deliberate gap for Persian cavalry that never arrived, a reminder that even perfect plans were hostage to timing and terrain. A decade later at Plataea for 79 BCE, the same system fought a different kind of battle, longer, messier, and on harsher ground. The Greek coalition held high positions, tried to avoid being pinned by Persian archers, and eventually slid into a night redeployment that partially unraveled. Here the formation's weakness showed. Movement under pressure could fray cohesion. Yet when the Spartans and Tegeans finally clashed with Mardonius infantry, their denser training and shield discipline turned a chaotic morning into a decisive shove forward. The hoplites needed every skill we've talked about: marching by file in the dark, reforming quickly, thrusting in tight ranks, and when they managed it, the Persian lack of heavy armor became an exposed seam. There's academic debate over how close to classic phalanx these battles were, since Greek lines sometimes loosened for terrain, but compared to Persian combined arms, Marathon and Plataea proved the citizen wall could beat an empire's toolkit if it chose the ground, kept its nerve, and struck as one. By the 4th century BCE, the world around the old Polis armies had shifted, and the phalanx found itself tested against unfamiliar rhythms. The Peloponnesian War strained citizen levies past their comfort zones. Endless sieges, naval campaigns, and long-distance operations punished a system built for short, decisive clashes close to home. At Delium for 24 BCE, an officially recognized and often cited battle, Athenian hoplites marched out confidently but lost cohesion during withdrawal, and a Theban counterattack shattered them. The formation functioned well in the opening shove, yet once the alignment frayed and cavalry appeared on the flanks, its weaknesses, rigidity, slow maneuvering, and dependence on staying packed, became painfully clear. Even a well-equipped hoplite needed skills in turning, maintaining spacing while retreating, and responding to sudden flank threats, and these were precisely the skills most citizen soldiers lacked. The Thebans under Epaminondas exposed another vulnerability: predictability. At Leuctra 371 BCE, they massed their best troops deep on the left and broke the Spartan right through sheer concentrated weight. There's academic debate about whether this invalidated the traditional phalanx or simply evolved it, but it undeniably showed that geometry could be reimagined. Strength shock power, shield interlock, moral cohesion remained, but rivals now targeted structural cracks instead of moral ones. A lesser-known detail: some sources suggest Theban musicians played unusually complex rhythms during the advance at Leuctra, perhaps to regulate the deeper columns' timing, a reminder that even tiny sensory cues mattered in keeping such dense ranks synchronized. Then came Macedon. Philip II's reforms introduced longer sarissa pikes, lighter shields, and professional drilling, turning the phalanx from a civic mass into a specialized battlefield engine. Compared to Athenian or Spartan hoplites, these new pikemen were more flexible on campaign, yet more dependent on combined arms, especially cavalry, to protect their flanks. the classical hoplite line, proud and stubborn, found itself increasingly outclassed whenever maneuver, missiles, and cavalry tightened the noose. Still, its influence lingered, the culture of disciplined ranks, the ideal of the citizen soldier, and the belief that a community could defend itself by locking shields. Even in decline, the old formation revealed its essence. Strength lay in unity, weakness in inflexibility, and the skills required precise footwork. Mutual trust, rhythmic cohesion remained timeless benchmarks that later armies borrowed, adapted, or rejected. The last echo of feet in bronze fades, and what's left is the logic the hoplites carried for centuries. Ordinary citizens, if they trusted each other enough to move as a block, could decide war in a single afternoon. In the narrow frame, they were built for set-piece battles on open ground. Against similarly equipped opponents, the classical phalanx was fiercely effective. It compressed courage into shared duty, multiplied the bite of each spear by the weight of many ranks, and made a city's politics and its battlefield mirror each other. But effectiveness has a shelf life. The moment enemies refused the contract skirmishing on broken terrain, peppering the line with missiles, slipping around flanks, or dragging campaigns on for months, the phalanx showed its seams. Its strengths became liabilities. Armor that anchored you also exhausted you. Close order that protected you also made turning and reforming slow. Citizen levies that fought best near home also struggled to stay cohesive far away. Greek observers sensed this tension. Xenophon praised drill to keep ranks steady, while others argued the system needed more specialists and lighter troops. A debate that never fully went away, compared to Roman maniples, which traded some shock for flexibility. Hoplites look stiff. Compared to Persian combined arms, they look one-dimensional. Yet compared to many contemporaries raiding warbands, aristocratic retinues, or lightly armored militias, they were a leap toward disciplined mass warfare. Their legacy is conceptual, cohesion as a weapon, civic identity as a source of morale, and the recurring truth that battlefield geometry only works if the men believe in it. The hoplite phalanx did not just win battles, it taught the Mediterranean that unity, not lone heroes, could rule the field. In that sense, its peak effectiveness was real but utterly conditional, and its decline was the cost of a fast-changing world.